Hey guys, welcome back. As always, I will read Reddit confession stories in background while playing Minecraft. So let's start. I never intended to be a whistleblower or a spy or whatever you want to call someone who holds a secret that could dismantle a multi-million-dollar company. Honestly, I just wanted to finish my quarterly reports so I could go home, order a mediocre pizza, and forget that I spend 40 hours a week staring at spreadsheets in a gray cubicle. My name is Mark, and for the last 5 years, I've been a mid-level analyst at Sterling & Associates, a firm that specializes in high-end real estate development and urban planning. It's the kind of job that is impressive enough to mention at a Thanksgiving dinner, but boring enough that nobody ever asks follow-up questions. My boss, Arthur Sterling, is exactly the kind of man you'd expect to run a place like this. He's 60, perpetually tanned, wears suits that cost more than my car, and has this way of looking through you rather than at you, as if you're just another piece of office furniture that happened to speak. The whole thing started on a Tuesday, which is always the worst day of the week because the weekend is a distant memory and Friday feels like an impossibility. Our IT department is notoriously understaffed, and they had been running a massive server migration for 3 days. Everything was glitchy. Files were disappearing, the internal chat was lagging, and the permissions for our shared drives were acting like they'd been put through a blender. Around 4 p.m., I needed to grab a template for a zoning proposal from the administrative folder, but when I clicked on the network drive, something fell off. Usually, I'm restricted to about 4 or 5 folders relevant to my department, but today, the sidebar was overflowing. There were folders for HR, for legal, for the board of directors, and right at the top, there was one labeled Executive Office, Private. Now, any sane person with a sense of self-preservation would have closed that window immediately, but curiosity is a powerful thing when you're bored and undervalued. I clicked it, expecting an access denied pop-up to slap me on the wrist. It didn't. Instead, the folder opened instantly, revealing a goldmine of subfolders. One of them was titled Email Archives, 2024 to 2026. I felt a sudden spike of adrenaline, that cold shiver that runs down your spine when you know you're doing something you absolutely shouldn't be. I told myself I was just checking to see if the IT glitch was really that bad, purely out of professional concern for the company's data security, of course. I opened the archive for the current month, and there they were, hundreds of Arthur Sterling's personal and professional emails, laid out in a simple text format. I started scrolling, mostly seeing boring stuff about golf tee times, angry notes to his interior decorator, and standard business correspondence. But then, I saw a thread with a subject line that consisted of just 3 numbers, a specific lot coordinate for a massive development project we were working on in the North End. We were calling it the Meridian, a supposed eco-friendly residential complex that was the pride and joy of the firm. The emails weren't with anyone in the company, though. They were with a private Gmail address. I clicked on the most recent one, and my stomach did a slow, heavy roll. The message from the private address read, "The soil samples came back. It's worse than we thought. If the city finds out about the toxicity levels, the whole project is dead and the fines will bankrupt us. We need to bury the report now." Arthur's reply was sent 3 minutes later. It was short, cold, and terrifyingly efficient. He wrote, "I've already handled the lab tech. The official report will show clean numbers. Start the foundation pour on Monday. Once the concrete is down, nobody is going to dig it up to double check. Just make sure the residential units are sold before the first-year inspections." I sat there in the silence of my cubicle, the hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounding like a roar in my ears. He wasn't just cutting corners. He was building a massive apartment complex on top of toxic waste and falsifying environmental records to do it. Hundreds of families would move in there. Children would play in the courtyard, and they'd be breathing in whatever chemicals were trapped beneath that concrete. I heard footsteps behind me and nearly jumped out of my skin, slamming my laptop shut so hard the plastic creaked. It was Sarah, one of the junior associates. She looked at me with a confused smile, asking if I was okay because I looked like I'd just seen a ghost. I forced a laugh, wiped the sweat from my forehead, and told her it was just too much caffeine. I waited until she walked away before I dared to open the laptop again. My hands were shaking. I knew I should report it, but to who? The CEO was the one writing the emails. The board members were his best friends. I realized in that moment that I wasn't just looking at a secret. I was looking at a death sentence for my career if I handled this wrong. I decided to do something impulsive, something I'd probably regret. I plugged in my personal thumb drive and copied the entire archive. Over the next few days, I became a different person. I was hyper-aware of everything Arthur did. Every time he walked past my desk, I felt like he could smell the betrayal on me. I spent my nights at home, sitting in the dark with my laptop, digging deeper into the emails I'd stolen. It wasn't just the toxic soil. There were kickbacks to city officials, offshore accounts used to dodge taxes, and a series of hush money payments to former employees who had clearly asked too many questions. The deeper I went, the more I realized that Sterling and Associates wasn't a real estate firm. It was a sophisticated criminal enterprise masked by mahogany desks and expensive art. The tension at work was becoming unbearable. Arthur had started holding more closed-door meetings, and the atmosphere in the office shifted from professional to paranoid. I heard rumors that IT was finally fixing the permissions issue, and that they were going to run an audit to see if anyone had accessed restricted files during the glitch. That was the moment the floor fell out from under me. If they ran an audit, they'd see my user ID had spent 45 minutes inside the CEO's private archives. I had to decide if I was going to run, confess, or fight. But as I was sitting there, staring at my screen and trying not to panic, I got a notification for a new calendar invite. It was a private meeting with Arthur Sterling, scheduled for 5 p.m. that evening. The subject line was blank. The walk to Arthur's office at 5 p.m. felt like a slow-motion walk to the gallows. The office was mostly empty by then, the late afternoon sun casting long, orange shadows across the plush carpeting. I knocked on his heavy oak door, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought he might actually hear it. When he called out for me to come in, his voice was as smooth and calm as ever. He was sitting behind his desk, silhouetted against the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city he was currently poisoning. He didn't look angry. In fact, he looked almost bored. He gestured for me to sit down, and for a long minute, he didn't say anything. He just looked at me, tapping a silver fountain pen against a leather-bound notebook. "Mark," he finally said, his voice dropping an octave. "You've been with us for 5 years. You're a hard worker. You don't complain, you meet your deadlines, and you stay out of the office politics. I've always appreciated that about you." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He leaned forward, the light catching the sharp lines of his face. "So you can imagine my disappointment when IT brought me a report this afternoon. It seems someone spent quite a bit of time in my private files during the server migration. Someone using your credentials." He stopped tapping the pen. The silence in the room was suffocating. I had two choices. I could lie and say my account was hacked, or I could own it. But looking at him, I realized he already knew. He wasn't asking. He was observing how I'd squirm. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my voice. "The folders were open, Arthur." I was looking for a template, and I stumbled into it. He raised an eyebrow, a small, cold smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Stumbled? For 45 minutes? And then, if the logs are correct, you transferred a significant amount of data to an external drive." He stood up and walked around the desk, leaning against the edge of it, just inches from where I was sitting. "Let's skip the part where you pretend you're going to the authorities, Mark. We both know how that ends. I have friends in the DA's office, the police department, and the local news. By the time you finished your first statement, your reputation would be incinerated, and you'd likely find yourself facing charges for corporate espionage and data theft." He wasn't shouting. He was talking to me like a mentor giving a difficult lesson. That was the scariest part. He wasn't afraid of me at all. He reached into his drawer and pulled out a check, already filled out. He slid it across the desk toward me. I glanced down and saw a number that made my head spin. It was more than I'd earned in the last 5 years combined. "This is for your loyalty," he said. "And for the thumb drive. You hand it over, you delete any copies you have, and tomorrow, you're promoted to senior project manager with a 20% raise. You become part of the inner circle. You get to see how the world actually works, instead of how they teach it in textbooks." I looked at the check, then back at him. My mind was racing. If I took the money, I was an accomplice. If I didn't, I was a target. I thought about the families moving into the Meridian, and then I thought about my mounting student loans and my crumbling apartment. For a split second, the money felt like an exit strategy. But then I remembered an email I'd read the night before, one about a whistleblower from 3 years ago named Elena. The emails didn't say what happened to her, only that she was no longer a concern and that her settlement had been finalized. There was something about the phrasing that made my blood run cold. I realized then that Arthur didn't pay people to be loyal. He paid them to buy time until he could get rid of them permanently. I need a night to think about it, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. Arthur's smile faded just a fraction. He didn't like not getting an immediate yes. He studied me for a moment, then nodded slowly. Of course, it's a big life change. But Mark, don't do anything foolish. I'd hate to see such a promising career cut short because of a misguided sense of heroism. Go home. Get some sleep. I'll expect that drive on my desk by 9 a.m. tomorrow. I got up and walked out, not looking back. I didn't go home, though. I knew my apartment wasn't safe. If he was tracking my digital footprint, he likely had someone watching my place too. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, one of those places with sticky booths and flickering fluorescent lights where nobody asks questions. I sat in the back corner with my laptop, using a VPN and a burner hotspot I'd bought months ago for a trip. I started looking for Elena. It took hours of digging through social media and public records, but I finally found a lead. Elena hadn't just left the company. She had vanished. No new job, no social media activity, nothing. Her family had filed a missing persons report that was closed 2 months later due to lack of evidence. I felt a knot of pure terror tighten in my chest. This wasn't just about corporate greed anymore. This was about survival. As I was digging, I noticed something in the email metadata I'd missed before. Arthur wasn't the top of the chain. He was reporting to a holding company based in the Cayman Islands, and the person he was emailing there had a name that sounded familiar: Thomas Sterling. His father, the retired founder of the firm who was supposed to be living on a yacht in the Mediterranean. The emails between them were much more graphic. They talked about removing obstacles and cleaning up the mess in ways that left no room for misinterpretation. I realized I didn't just have evidence of a cover-up. I had evidence of a conspiracy that spanned decades. Around 3 a.m., my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of my front door, taken from the hallway of my apartment building. Underneath the photo was a single sentence: "Sleep well, Mark. See you at 9. My heart stopped. They were already there. They were waiting for me. I looked at the thumb drive sitting on the table next to my coffee. I had 5 hours to decide how this story was going to end, and for the first time in my life, I realized that playing by the rules was only going to get me killed. I took a sip of my cold coffee, opened a new encrypted email draft, and started typing the names of every major news outlet in the country. But I didn't hit send. I had a better idea, one that would ensure Arthur couldn't just bury me like he buried the toxic soil. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon when I pulled into the parking lot of a high-end gym near the office. I knew the building had a secure locker room and, more importantly, a public Wi-Fi that was fast and didn't require a login. I sat in my car for a few minutes, watching the morning commuters start to fill the streets. I felt a strange sense of calm. The panic had been replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. I knew Arthur was expecting me to show up at 9 a.m., terrified and ready to trade my soul for a paycheck. He thought he had me figured out because he thought everyone was as greedy as he was. That was his biggest mistake. I didn't send the emails to the news outlets. Not yet. Instead, I did something much more dangerous. I used the access I still had, because IT hadn't officially revoked my permissions until the morning audit, and I scheduled a company-wide emergency town hall via Zoom for 8:45 a.m. I set the sender as Office of the CEO and marked it as mandatory for all staff, including the board and the investors. Then, I spent the next hour preparing the presentation. I didn't use fancy slides. I just used the emails. I cropped them, highlighted the most damning sentences, and paired them with the photos of the toxic soil reports I'd found buried in the archives. At 8:30 a.m., I walked into the Sterling and Associates building. I didn't go to my desk. I went straight to the main conference room, the one with the massive glass walls and the $50,000 table. I locked the door from the inside. A few minutes later, I saw Arthur walking down the hallway, looking refreshed and confident. He saw me through the glass and stopped, a look of confusion crossing his face. He tried the handle, but it didn't budge. He tapped on the glass, gesturing for me to open up, his expression shifting from confusion to annoyance. I just looked at him and pointed to the large monitor mounted on the wall. I started the Zoom call. Because it was sent from the CEO's internal account. Over 400 employees and dozens of investors joined almost instantly. I saw the little squares filling up the screen, faces of people I'd worked with for years, people who had no idea they were part of a criminal enterprise. Arthur was now pounding on the glass, his face turning a deep, angry purple. He was shouting something, but the room was soundproof. I turned on the microphone and began to speak, my voice echoing through the speakers of every laptop and computer in the firm. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "My name is Mark, and before I'm fired in about 5 minutes, there's something you all need to see." I hit share screen. I started with the soil samples. I showed the clean report next to the real one. I showed Arthur's email about burying the report and falsifying the foundation pour. I heard a collective gasp through the audio feed. Someone had forgotten to mute their mic. I moved on to the kickbacks, the offshore accounts, and finally, the folder about Elena. I didn't have proof of what happened to her, but the silence from the audience as I showed the hush money logs was louder than any scream. Arthur was now throwing his shoulder against the door, calling for security. I saw 2 guards running down the hall with a master key. I had maybe 30 seconds left. I looked directly into the camera. "Arthur Sterling told me last night that he owns the city. He told me that no one would listen to a mid-level analyst. Maybe he's right, but he doesn't own all of you. And he doesn't own the internet." I hit one final button on my laptop. I had set up a scripted upload to a public cloud drive, and the link was being sent to every contact in our client database. Thousands of people, from city planners to high-end buyers. The door burst open. The security guards grabbed me, pulling my arms behind my back, while Arthur stormed into the room. He didn't even look at me. He lunged for the laptop, frantically trying to shut it down, but it was too late. The upload complete notification was glowing on the screen. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a level of rage I've never seen in another human being. He looked like he wanted to kill me right there in front of the cameras. "You're done," he hissed, his voice trembling. "I will make sure you never work again. I will take everything you have. You have no idea what you've just started." "Actually, Arthur," I said, as the security guards started dragging me out, "I think I just finished it." The aftermath was a blur. I was arrested for unauthorized access to computer systems, but the story was already out. It was the lead on every local news station within an hour. By the afternoon, the EPA had issued a stop work order on the Meridian, and the FBI was at the office with a search warrant. The unauthorized access charges against me were eventually dropped in exchange for my testimony. The public outcry was so massive that even Arthur's friends in the DA's office couldn't protect him. The firm collapsed within a month. It's been a year since that day. I'm not a senior project manager, and I'm definitely not rich. I work for a small nonprofit now, helping with urban sustainability projects. It pays half of what I made at Sterling, and I'm still living in that same crumbling apartment. But every morning, I wake up and I don't feel that heavy, sinking feeling in my gut. I sometimes think about the check Arthur slid across the desk, that life of easy luxury and dark secrets. But then I remember the look on his face when he realized he couldn't buy his way out of the truth. There's a small park near the Meridian site now. They had to dig up the entire foundation and replace the soil, a process that cost the investors hundreds of millions. They turned part of it into a memorial for Elena, whose body was found in a shallow grave on one of the Sterling family's private estates 3 months after the trial began. I go there sometimes and just sit on a bench, watching people walk their dogs and breathe the clean air. I didn't just get access to my boss's emails that day. I got access to my own conscience. And honestly, that's the only thing that's ever been worth keeping. This next story is more interesting. I used to think that the biggest secret my girlfriend was hiding was just a messy apartment or maybe a roommate she was embarrassed by. But looking back now, I would give anything for it to have been something that simple. We had been dating for 8 months, and in that time, I'd learned everything about her. Or at least I thought I had. Except for the one place she spent her nights. She was the kind of person who could light up a room just by walking into it. Always smiling, always knowing exactly what to say to make me feel like I was the only person in the world. Yet there was this one massive, glaring boundary that I wasn't allowed to cross. It started off as a joke between us during the first few weeks. I'd offer to drop her off after dinner, and she'd always have me pull over at a gas station or a coffee shop a few blocks away from her actual street, claiming she needed the walk to clear her head or that her parking situation was a nightmare. At first, I didn't think twice about it because everyone has their quirks, especially in a city like Chicago where parking is basically a blood sport. But as the months rolled by and our relationship got more serious, that boundary started to feel less like a quirk and more like a wall. Her name was Sarah, and she was a freelance graphic designer, or that's what her business card said anyway. She was smart, incredibly attentive, and she lived for the small details. The way I liked my coffee, the specific brand of pens I used at work, the exact temperature I kept my apartment. She was perfect, almost too perfect, which is probably why I let the no visiting rule slide for as long as I did. I figured she was just private, or maybe she lived in a place that didn't match the polished image she presented to the world, and I didn't want to make her feel insecure by forcing my way in. But then came the night of our 8-month anniversary. We had a great dinner at this high-end steakhouse downtown, and the wine had been flowing pretty steadily. I was feeling that warm, comfortable glow of being in love, and as we walked back to my car, I suggested we head back to her place for a change. I told her I'd bring over that bottle of vintage wine I'd been saving, and we could just relax on her couch instead of mine. The moment the words left my mouth, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a dramatic change, but I felt her hand stiffen in mine, and that signature smile of hers faltered for just a fraction of a second before she recovered. She laughed it off, saying her place was a total disaster zone because of a big project she was finishing up, and she didn't want me to see her creative chaos just yet. It was the same excuse she'd used a dozen times before, but this time, it felt thin. I looked at her, really looked at her under the orange glow of the streetlights, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine fear in her eyes. It wasn't the fear of a messy room. It was the fear of a person who was backed into a corner. I didn't push it that night because I didn't want to ruin the evening, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it started growing faster than I could manage. Over the next week, I found myself noticing things I'd overlooked before. She never stayed the entire night at my place, always making an excuse to leave around 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock in the morning, claiming she had an early start or that she couldn't sleep well in a bed that wasn't hers. She'd get these phone calls at odd hours, always stepping into the hallway or the bathroom to answer them, her voice dropping to a whisper that I couldn't quite catch. When she'd come back, she'd be slightly flushed, her eyes darting around as if she were checking to see if I'd been listening. I tried to talk to my best friend, Mark, about it over drinks. He told me I was being paranoid and that maybe she was just one of those ultra-independent types, or maybe she was hiding a cat she wasn't supposed to have. We laughed about it, but the laughter felt hollow. I knew Sarah, and she wasn't the type to care about a lease violation. There was something deeper, something she was guarding with a level of intensity that felt almost physical. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was off work early and decided to surprise her with lunch. I knew she usually worked from a small co-working space near River North, so I headed over there with a bag of her favorite Thai food. When I got there, the receptionist looked at me like I had two heads when I asked for Sarah. She checked the system and told me no one by that name had a membership there, and they hadn't had a freelance designer in that office for months. I felt a cold pit form in my stomach. I called Sarah, and she picked up on the third ring, sounding perfectly normal, telling me she was buried in spreadsheets at the office and couldn't talk for long. I stood there in the lobby of a building she wasn't in, listening to her lie to my face with a level of ease that was honestly terrifying. I didn't confront her right then. Instead, I hung up, went back to my car, and waited. I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't just sit at home and pretend everything was fine anymore. About an hour later, I saw her walking down the street about 2 blocks away from where she claimed to be. She wasn't carrying a laptop bag or looking like a stressed-out designer. She was dressed in a plain, oversized hoodie and jeans, looking over her shoulder every few seconds. I followed her at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might actually break. She didn't go to a fancy apartment complex or a trendy loft. She walked toward the outskirts of the West Loop, into an area that was mostly industrial warehouses and older, crumbling brick buildings that looked like they should have been condemned years ago. She stopped in front of a heavy steel door at the side of a gray, windowless building that had no signage, no lights, nothing. She pulled out a key, swiped a key card I'd never seen before, and vanished inside. I sat in my car across the street for 3 hours, watching that door. No one else went in, and no one came out. The building looked completely abandoned from the outside, But as the sun started to set, I noticed a faint, flickering blue light coming from a single small vent high up on the wall. It looked like the glow of a television or a monitor. My mind was racing through every possible scenario. Was she a drug dealer? Was she living in a squat? Was she cheating on me with someone who lived in this hellhole? None of it made sense. Sarah loved luxury. She loved fine dining and silk sheets and expensive perfumes. Nothing about this building matched the woman I loved. I eventually drove home, but I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face in the moonlight, that split second of fear I'd seen on our anniversary. I realized then that I didn't actually know Sarah at all. I knew the version of her she'd built for me, a carefully curated character designed to fit perfectly into my life. The next morning, I made a choice that I would come to regret. I decided that if she wouldn't let me into her world, I was going to find my own way in. I spent the next 2 days doing a deep dive into the property records for that warehouse. It was owned by a holding company that led to another holding company, eventually dead-ending at a legal firm in Delaware. It was a ghost building, but I managed to find a listing for the neighboring property that mentioned the warehouse had been a private storage facility for a medical supply company that went bankrupt in the late 90s. Friday night arrived, and Sarah told me she had to go out of town for a design conference in Madison. She even showed me the hotel confirmation on her phone. I kissed her goodbye, told her to have a safe drive, and waited until I saw her car pull out of my complex. Then, I grabbed a heavy-duty flashlight, a small crowbar I kept in the trunk for emergencies, and headed back to the warehouse. The street was dead silent when I arrived. The air felt heavy, smelling of damp concrete and old exhaust. I didn't go for the steel door she'd used. I knew that was likely alarmed or at least reinforced. Instead, I circled the building until I found a rusted loading bay in the back. One of the smaller service doors had a gap at the bottom where the metal had rotted away. It took 20 minutes of sweating and prying, my hands shaking the entire time, but I finally managed to pop the latch from the inside. As I stepped into the darkness of the warehouse, the first thing that hit me wasn't the smell of rot or dust. It was the smell of bleach. It was so strong it made my eyes water instantly. I clicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick, heavy air. The ground floor was mostly empty, just rows of rusted metal shelving and stacks of old wooden pallets. But in the center of the room, there was a modern, clean-looking elevator door that looked completely out of place in this ruin. I didn't take the elevator. I found the stairs, my boots echoing on the metal steps with a sound that felt loud enough to wake the dead. I climbed to the 3rd floor, where I'd seen the blue light from the vent. When I pushed open the heavy fire door, I expected to find a hidden apartment or maybe a secret studio. What I found was a hallway lined with thick, soundproof doors, each one fitted with a digital keypad and a small viewing pane of reinforced glass. It looked like a high-security wing of a hospital or a prison. I walked slowly down the hall, the beam of my light shaking as I approached the first door. I peered through the glass, and my breath caught in my throat. Inside was a room that looked like a perfect replica of a child's bedroom from the 1950s. Everything was pristine. The wallpaper, the small wooden bed, the toys neatly arranged on the floor. But there was no one inside. I moved to the next door. This one was a kitchen, again, styled in a completely different era, looking like something out of a black and white sitcom. I kept moving, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, until I reached the very end of the hall. This door didn't have a keypad. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of that same flickering blue light spilling out into the corridor. I could hear a sound coming from inside, a low, rhythmic humming, like someone singing a lullaby to themselves. I pushed the door open, the hinges giving a soft, agonizing creak. The room was massive, filled with rows upon rows of glowing computer monitors and server racks that hummed with a mechanical life. And there, sitting in the middle of it all, was Sarah. She wasn't looking at the screens. She was sitting in a plush velvet armchair, the kind she had in her own imaginary living room, and she was holding a heavy, leather-bound book. But she wasn't reading. She was staring at a wall covered in hundreds of photographs. I stepped closer, the light from my flashlight catching the edges of the pictures, and I felt the world tilt on its axis. Every single photo was of me. Me at the grocery store. Me sleeping in my bed. Me talking to Mark at the bar. Me at work. There were dates, times, and detailed notes scribbled in the margins of the photos, documenting my every move for the last 3 years. 3 years. I had only known her for 8 months. I must have made a sound, a small gasp or a shuffle of my feet, because Sarah suddenly froze. She didn't turn around quickly. She slowly closed the book, stood up, and turned to face me with a look of such profound sadness that it was more terrifying than any expression of anger could have been. "I told you," she whispered, her voice sounding hollow in the vast, humming room. "I told you that you didn't want to see where I lived, Michael." The silence that followed her words was suffocating. I stood there, the flashlight trembling in my hand, its beam dancing across the faces of my own life pinned to that wall like specimens in a lab. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. All I could do was stare at her, at this woman who looked exactly like the girlfriend I loved, but who was standing in the middle of a high-tech stalking den. "Sarah, what is this?" I finally managed to choke out. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, thin and cracking. "Why are there photos of me from years ago? We met at that gallery opening in August. You said you'd never seen me before." She took a step toward me, and I instinctively flinched, backing into a server rack that hummed with a low, vibrating heat. She stopped, her hands held out in a gesture of peace, but her eyes were wet with tears. "I never lied about loving you, Michael," she said, and the sincerity in her voice made my skin crawl. "The gallery opening wasn't an accident. Nothing since then has been an accident. I spent 2 years making sure that when we finally met, I would be the exact person you needed." I looked back at the wall. There were charts. Not just photos, but charts of my heart rate, my sleep cycles, my caloric intake. There were transcripts of conversations I'd had with my mother, notes on my childhood traumas, even a list of my biggest fears. It wasn't just stalking, it was an anatomical breakdown of my entire existence. "Who are you?" I whispered. "And who are you working for?" Sarah sighed, a long, weary sound, and sat back down in the velvet chair. She looked exhausted, the polished, vibrant version of her I knew beginning to peel away to reveal something much more fragile and broken underneath. "I don't work for anyone," she said softly. "Not anymore. This started as a project, a study on human connection and the perfect partner algorithm. I was part of a research group, Michael. We were supposed to see if we could engineer a soulmate by using data to bridge the gaps in personality compatibility." She gestured to the room around us. This building belonged to the lead researcher. When the funding was pulled and the project was shut down, I couldn't leave. I couldn't just walk away from you. I had seen everything about you. I knew the way you cried when your dog died when you were 10. I knew the way you felt like a failure when you didn't get that promotion at the firm. I fell in love with the data, and then I realized I had to make the data real. I felt a wave of nausea hit me. The design conference in Madison, the late-night phone calls, the secret apartment. It wasn't another man or a drug habit. It was the maintenance of a lie so massive it required a warehouse full of servers just to keep it running. She had been monitoring me in real time, adjusting her personality, her clothes, her opinions, all based on the data she was collecting from the sensors I didn't even know were in my own home. "You bugged my apartment?" I asked, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Only to ensure I was being what you needed," she replied, as if that made it better. "If you were having a bad day, I knew to be supportive. If you needed space, I knew to pull back. I've given you the most perfect 8 months of your life, Michael. Have you ever been happier? Have you ever felt more understood?" "It wasn't real," I shouted, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "None of it was real. You're a stranger. You're a ghost who's been haunting my life for 3 years." She stood up again, her face hardening. "It is real. The feelings are real. The time we spent together happened. Does it matter how we got there if the result is the same? I know you better than you know yourself. I know that right now, your adrenaline is spiking, your cortisol levels are off the charts, and you're contemplating whether to call the police or just run. But you won't call the police, Michael, because you know that if you do, everything we have disappears, and you'll go back to being that lonely, bored man I found 3 years ago." She walked over to a desk and picked up a tablet, sliding her finger across the screen. Suddenly, the monitors on the wall changed. They stopped showing my past and started showing my present. I saw myself standing in the room from 4 different angles. I saw the heat signature of my body. I even saw a live feed of my own apartment, empty and quiet, but wired for sound and sight. "I have everything saved," she said, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. "Every moment of us. But I also have things you wouldn't want the world to see. I know the things you've searched for when you thought you were alone. I know the small, petty crimes you've committed. I know the secrets you've never told anyone. The threat was subtle, but it was there. She wasn't just a stalker. She was a curator of my life, and she owned the archive. I looked at the steel door, calculating my chances of making a run for it, but she seemed to read my mind. The doors are locked, Michael. I saw you come in through the loading bay. I let you. I knew this day would come eventually. I just hoped it would be later, after we were married, after you had so much invested in us that the truth wouldn't matter. Married, I choked out. You thought I would marry you after this? I knew you would, she corrected. Because I would make sure you wanted to. That's what I do. I make people want what I want them to want. The chill that went down my spine was icy. This wasn't just love or obsession. It was a total breakdown of reality. I was standing in a room with a woman who had spent years simulating a life with me before it even began. I felt like I was in a cage, one built of high-speed fiber optics and deep-seated psychological manipulation. Why me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Out of everyone in this city, why did you pick me for your project? Sarah walked over to the wall of photos and traced the outline of my face in a picture taken while I was sitting in a park 2 years ago. Because you were the most average subject we found, she said softly. You were a blank slate. You had no strong ties, no grand passions, just a quiet life waiting to be filled. You were the perfect vessel for the experiment. But then, as I watched you, I saw the potential. I saw the man you could be if you just had the right person by your side. I didn't just want to study you. I wanted to create you. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated terror. She didn't love me. She loved the version of me she was building. I was her masterpiece, a living, breathing project that she was molding in this warehouse. I'm leaving, I said, my voice firmer now. I don't care about the doors. I don't care about the secrets. I'm walking out of here, and I'm going to the police, and I'm going to make sure you never come near me again. I turned toward the door, but before I could take a step, the lights in the warehouse suddenly cut out. The only thing remaining was the dim, flickering blue light from the monitors, casting long, distorted shadows across the room. I can't let you do that, Michael. Sarah's voice came from the darkness, sounding strangely distant. You're not ready to leave yet. We haven't finished our anniversary celebration. I heard a click, the sound of a heavy bolt sliding into place. I ran for the door, slamming my shoulder against it, but it was solid steel and didn't budge. I turned around, swinging my flashlight, but the beam hit nothing but empty air. Sarah was gone. Sarah, I screamed, the sound echoing off the cold walls. Open this door. This is kidnapping. You can't keep me here. I'm not keeping you here. Her voice came over a hidden intercom system, sounding smooth and artificial. I'm just giving you time to process. There's food in the 1950s kitchen downstairs. There's a bed in the nursery. You should rest. We have a lot of work to do on us tomorrow. I spent the next several hours in a state of blind panic. I tried the vents. I tried prying the door. I tried smashing the server racks, but everything was reinforced. The warehouse was a fortress. As the night wore on, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a crushing sense of despair. I found myself wandering back to the wall of photos, looking at the years of my life she had stolen. I saw pictures of me at funerals I'd forgotten the details of. I saw me standing in line at the DMV, looking bored. I saw me crying in my car after a breakup 3 years ago. She had been there for all of it. Every private moment, every secret shame, she had been watching through a lens. Around 4 a.m., I found a small vent in the floor of the main server room. It was small, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through, but it didn't look as reinforced as the others. I used my crowbar, prying at the grate until my knuckles bled and my muscles screamed. Finally, with a loud crack, the metal gave way. I didn't know where it led, but I didn't care. I slid into the dark, cramped space, the smell of dust and old grease filling my lungs. I crawled for what felt like miles, my hands scraping against the rough metal, the sound of my own breathing loud and ragged in the confined space. Eventually, the vent opened up into a vertical shaft. I looked down and saw a faint light at the bottom. I began to climb down the rusted ladder rungs, my heart leaping with every creak of the metal. When I reached the bottom, I pushed open a small service hatch and tumbled out onto a concrete floor. I was in the basement. It was cold, damp, and smelled strongly of earth. But as I looked around, I realized I wasn't alone. In the corner of the room, sitting on a simple wooden chair under a single bare light bulb, was a man. He looked to be in his 60s, his hair thin and white, his skin pale like he hadn't seen the sun in years. He was staring at a wall, but this wall wasn't covered in photos. It was covered in handwritten notes, thousands of them, taped to every available inch of space. "You must be Michael," the man said, his voice raspy and thin. He didn't turn to look at me. "She's been talking about you for a long time." "Who are you?" I asked, backing away toward the shadows. "I was the first," the man said, finally turning his head. His eyes were milky with cataracts, but there was a sharp, piercing intelligence in them. "I was the first perfect partner experiment. I've been here for 12 years, Michael. And let me tell you, she doesn't like it when her projects try to leave." The man's words hit me like a physical blow, leaving me breathless in the damp chill of the basement. 12 years. I looked at his frail frame, the way his clothes hung off his skeletal shoulders, and a terrifying realization began to dawn on me. Sarah wasn't just a stalker or a rogue researcher. This was a cycle. "What do you mean? You were the first?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Sarah, she's not that old. She couldn't have been doing this 12 years ago." The man gave a dry, rattling laugh that turned into a coughing fit. "Sarah is the face," he finally wheezed. "Sarah is the interface. The woman you know is just the latest version. The project, the algorithm, it stays the same. They just change the skin when the old one gets too familiar or too tired." I felt the room spinning. "They? Who are they?" "The ones who own the warehouse," he whispered, gesturing vaguely at the ceiling. "The ones who want to know how to control the human heart. They found that if you can simulate a soulmate, you can control a person entirely. They don't want money, Michael. They want devotion. They want a world where everyone is paired with a perfect partner who reports back to the source." I looked at the notes on his wall. They weren't just observations, they were confessions. I don't remember my mother's face. I forgot the name of my first dog. She told me these are my memories now. The man had been systematically stripped of his own identity and replaced with the narrative they had provided. "You have to get out," the man said, his eyes suddenly wide with a frantic urgency. "She's coming back. She's not at a conference. She's in the walls. She's everywhere in this building. If she finds you down here, she'll start the re-education phase. That's when the real nightmare begins." As if on cue, the heavy steel door at the top of the basement stairs groaned open. I didn't wait to see who it was. I scrambled back toward the vent I'd crawled out of, but it was too high to reach from the floor. I looked around wildly for another exit, my flashlight beam landing on a heavy wooden door tucked behind a stack of crates. I bolted for it, throwing my weight against the wood. It was locked. I swung the crowbar with every ounce of strength I had left, the wood splintering with a deafening crack. I kicked the door open and found myself in a narrow, dirt-floored tunnel that smelled of wet earth and decay. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I ran until my lungs burned and my legs felt like they were on fire. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning under the streets of Chicago. I could hear footsteps behind me, not the heavy boots of a guard, but the light, rhythmic click-clack of heels on concrete. "Sarah! Michael! Stop!" Her voice echoed through the tunnel, sounding unervingly calm. "You're going to hurt yourself. There's nothing out there for you anymore. I've already closed your bank accounts. I've sent the emails to your boss. I've told your mother you're going away for a while to clear your head. You don't exist out there anymore, Michael. You only exist here, with me." The horror of what she was saying fueled a new burst of speed. She was erasing me. While I had been trapped in the warehouse, she had been systematically dismantling my life with the click of a mouse. I wasn't just losing my girlfriend, I was losing my entire identity. I saw a glimmer of light ahead, a rusted iron grate set into the ceiling of the tunnel. I reached it and jumped, grabbing the bars and pulling myself up with a desperate, primal strength. I pushed the grate with my head and shoulders, feeling it give way. I scrambled out and found myself in a dark alleyway, the cold night air hitting me like a blessing. I didn't stop to look back. I ran toward the lights of the main street, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. I saw a taxi idling at a red light and dove into the back seat, screaming at the driver to just go. He looked at my bloodied hands and torn clothes and didn't ask questions. He just hit the gas. I went straight to the police station. I sat in the fluorescent-lit waiting room for 3 hours, shaking uncontrollably, until a detective finally agreed to see me. I told him everything. The warehouse, the photos, the old man in the basement, the way Sarah had predicted my every move. He listened with a skeptical expression, taking notes, but I could tell he thought I was having a mental breakdown. "Look, Mr. Henderson," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We'll send a car over to check out the address, but you have to understand. People have private lives. If your girlfriend is a bit obsessive, that's a civil matter, not a criminal one. And as for the underground project, it sounds a bit like something out of a movie, don't you think? Go to the warehouse." I pleaded. "Just go there. Look at the servers. Look at the man in the basement." He sighed and stood up. "Stay here. We'll be back in an hour." I waited. It was the longest hour of my life. When the detective returned, his face was blank. "We checked the address, Michael. It's an empty warehouse. No servers. No nursery. Number 1950s kitchen. Just some old crates and a lot of dust. We checked the basement, too. It's a standard utility room. Empty. That's impossible," I shouted, standing up. "I was just there. I saw it." "The building is owned by a perfectly legitimate real estate firm," he continued, ignoring my outburst. "And we contacted your girlfriend, Sarah. She's in Madison, Michael. She's at her conference. She was very concerned when we told her what happened. She said you've been under a lot of stress lately and that you've had episodes in the past." The room went cold. She had gotten to them. Or rather, she had already prepared the narrative for this exact moment. She had built a history of mental instability for me that I didn't even know existed. "She's lying," I whispered. "She's making it all up. She's on her way back now to pick you up," the detective said, his voice softening. "She's very worried about you. Why don't you just sit tight and let her take you home?" I realized then that I was truly trapped. There was no escape from a woman who owned your past, your present, and now, your sanity. If I stayed, she would take me back to that empty warehouse, and I would become the next man in the basement, a forgotten project in a leather-bound book. I stood up and walked toward the door. "I need to go to the bathroom," I said. The detective nodded, and I walked out of the room. I didn't go to the bathroom. I walked out the back exit of the station and vanished into the night. That was 6 months ago. I've been living off the grid ever since. I don't use credit cards. I don't have a phone. I moved from town to town, working under the table at diners and construction sites. I sleep in cheap motels and avoided anything with a camera. I thought I was safe. I thought I had finally slipped through the cracks of her algorithm. But this morning, I woke up in a small town in Oregon. I walked into a local diner for breakfast, and when the waitress brought me my coffee, she smiled at me. A familiar, perfect smile that made my blood run cold. "You forgot your sugar, Michael," she said, placing 2 packets on the table. I looked down at the packets. They weren't standard sugar packets. They were hand-wrapped in paper that matched the wallpaper of the nursery in the warehouse. On the back, in Sarah's neat, elegant handwriting, were 4 words that I know will be the last things I ever read. "The experiment isn't over." I looked up, but the waitress was already walking away, her heels clicking rhythmically on the linoleum floor. I looked around the diner and realized that every person in the room, the old man in the corner, the couple in the booth, the cook behind the counter, was watching me. They weren't eating. They weren't talking. They were just waiting. I realized then that she was right. I don't exist out here. I never did. I'm just a data point in a world she's built for me, and no matter how far I run, I'm always exactly where she wants me to be. I'm going to finish my coffee now, and then I'm going to walk out to the car that I know is waiting for me in the parking lot. Because at the end of the day, there's no point in fighting the person who knows you better than you know yourself. I found out why she never let me visit her place. And God help me, I think I'm finally ready to go home.